Over here sitting down, you may want to know where lionwood comes from. We used to have a farm up on Thomas Road. We had a herd of registered Holsteins, and you had to have a prefix. So it was lionwood. When we moved down here, we brought the prefix with us. So that's what's on the sign. I hope you all can see the sign, can you? Of the screen?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. 2 cautions, you probably already know about them. The floor is uneven, and there may be a few nails sticking through these walls too. Be careful. About 18 years ago, we decided that we wanted to do something with this barn. It was not in good shape. So at that time, the state had that new barn program, and our speaker was heavy involved with that. So we signed up. We had to pay a little bit of a down payment with it. But the state came through with a goodly amount of money, and those who paid taxes back to the state, this is the result of that. This was completely renovated by their heritage group out of New Woodstock. And we thank you for that, and you can pat yourself on the back also. So, anyway, I'm going to introduce Jim George. He's our Earlville Nelson Heritage Society chairman, and he is going to pass it on from there.
Thanks, Frank. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to tout our 3 times a year newsletter, Hills and Hollows. I know all the Nelson people are familiar with it, but those of you from Cazenovia who aren't, in New Woodstock, it's in the we put some copies in the Caz library, and there's a form in the back to join our group, and you get a newsletter every 3 times a year that way. Just want to put a little advertisement in there. It's mostly about the town of Nelson and Erieville things, but we do extend over the border occasionally to Fenner and Cazenovia. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Ann Ferguson now, Cazenovia Heritage. She's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I actually don't think I'll need this, Mike, but first of all, welcome all of you. I'm so glad so many of you came out even with the rain. And also thank you to Margie and Faye Lyon for allowing us to host this program here today. Usually when we do a program, I've been told I'm required to say where are the emergency exits and where are the bathrooms. And today you're on your own, okay? But you're going to learn a lot today, and we want to keep that learning going. So from today, for the next 2 weeks, through September 1st, Cazenovia Heritage is offering a driving tour of historic barns in Cazenovia. And there are 9 barns that are featured on the tour that highlight many of the things that we're going to talk about today. And all of the barns who are participating have a sign that looks something like this. Okay, so they are identified. It's a drive-by tour. It's exteriors only. There's no expectation that you're going to go into these people's homes or barns, so respect their privacy there. But the map for the tour, is available on our website, cazheritage.org, and you can download it and print it off. It will give you a map on where all of the barns are located, along with some notes on what to look for, what their features are, and notes on the architectural styles. If you don't have a printer and you need a map, see me after the program. I brought some with me in case you want to take one home with you. There are also various historic homes on the sites where these barns are. Please make note of them too. I know particularly for Cazenovia Heritage folks, the last year you've learned a lot about Greek Revival, Federal, Italianate. You're going to see all of those on the tour of the barns as well. So keep your eye out for that. Lastly, today we are lucky that, and fortunate, I should say, that we have a leading expert on the architecture and preservation of barns that lives right here in Cazenovia. So I'm very grateful that Randy Nash agreed to talk to us today and impart some of his knowledge and observations about the history of barns in Cazenovia. Randy.
Thanks, Ann. Oh, there's the mic.
You have your own.
Okay, good. All right. The mic is because we are recording this, and it'll be on the websites, and who knows, it may go viral. I'm hoping that I don't have a Biden moment here. I'm thinking of the things that I wanted to start talking about, and then I'm thinking about the things my wife said not to do. So I'm going to be walking back and forth through here. And because it's being filmed, I've been choreographed. Do not stand here. You're either here or back there. Can everybody hear me back in there? So we were debating on whether we'd need a microphone or not on it. So I'm going to give you a little information about an artifact that's disappearing from the landscape. And I'm going to give you some information. You know how you see the signs driving into Cazenovia where it says 1793? Well, I'm going to tell you why it says 1793. And you see Lincoln written all over the place. The Lincoln House, Lincoln Street, Town of Lincoln. I'm going to tell you why Lincoln is a prominent name in the area. And I'm also going to talk about, in the beginning, the first barn in the area. Now we do have sort of an interesting situation here. I have my family on my son's side from Arizona and Idaho here. We have new neighbors where we live in Caz, my wife and I, who are from Chicago. And one of my wife's good friends is here who grew up in Minnesota. We have a number of people that aren't from the area. And so I don't usually talk about New York State's settlement, but I wanted to give a little bit of background on what happened here in New York State, because as people from upstate, we know that people from the rest of the country have no idea that upstate even exists. They think of New York City with it. New York State was actually settled in two distinct periods. And the first period deals before the Revolutionary War. And it was just a small section of New York State that was settled before the war. The Hudson River Valley, the Mohawk River Valley, and Long Island. Next slide.
Oh, sorry. Got it.
There we go. The rest of New York at that time was Iroquois. It was the land of the Five Nations. And practically all of New York State at that time was covered with trees. And that's actually a picture from my house looking over DeRuyter Lake to give you an idea where that is. But this was their hunting territory and where they lived. On the eve of the Revolution, the majority of New York State was just a virgin forest, a climax northern hardwood forest. After the Revolution, and I'm condensing probably one of the most complicated periods in American history into a couple of lines. For the Revolution, basically, this is Native American territory. After the Revolution, this was European American territory. Next slide. And New York State was divided up with a bunch of lines and was put up for sale. And that's where our story begins, is when the state was put up for sale, we have this little section right in the middle. That area was actually a surveying area back then, and which worked out to the state's advantage because the land was there. They said, well, as long as it's there, we'll just mark it off and put it up for sale. The Holland Land Company bought that little section of land. That section of land is about 30 miles long, 4 miles wide, about 100,000 acres. Next slide. They also bought the township of Nelson, which was in the 20 townships. That's where you're setting right now. And I should say that this program is focused on where you're setting right now. 90% of the buildings I'm going to show are within the 2 townships of Cazenovia and Nelson. Next slide. And that shows the 2 townships of Caz right there. And that little black spot in the middle, that's Cazenovia Lake. So here's a picture. Can you guys see over there? Well, try to not block anybody, that's tough. A lot of people will recognize this. This is John Lincoln. So where did John Lincoln, why is John Lincoln connected with all this? Well, that Holland Land Company that bought the land that we saw there and put it up for sale, his uncle essentially was the head honcho of that company. And this is a group of people back in Holland that wanted to invest in America. John, actually he was sort of John's surrogate father in some respects. John's folks died when he was in his early teens, in about 13. John at 14 joined the Dutch Navy. And he was on the Navy for about 8 years. When he was 22, Peter Stednexty, I don't know if that's the exact proper pronunciation, but his uncle asked him, or maybe even told him, I'd like you to go to America and look at some land for us and see what you think. And so at 22, he ended up coming here, and he's the one they asked to come up here and sell this land for the company. He was the one to survey it out, take the money, and send it back to Holland. He is a primary character in the story of our first barn. Next slide. This is a better picture of what you should think about of John Lincoln. He was only 24 when he actually came up here for the first time in 1792, actually. Next slide. This picture people probably won't recognize. This is Sam Foreman. You've heard of Foreman Street. The Holland Land Company asked him to run the store of their up at the establishment. And to put a little context, let's see if I can read this. In Sam Foreman's memoirs, he grew up in New Jersey. He spent the winter of 1792-93 in Philadelphia. And on March 4th, 1793, I had the high satisfaction to witness the second inauguration of General Washington as President of the United States in Philadelphia. 2 months later, Sam Foreman is at the end of Cazenovia Lake setting up the land office. Next slide. So the Holland Land Company asked Sam Foreman to hire a mason, a carpenter, a teamster, and some woodsmen with an axe. And he also asked him to collect all the materials they would need, a family would need to start a farm in the woods, tents and food, and they all headed up the Hudson River, the Mohawk River, and they were in the Fort Schuyler in May of 1793. At that point, they bought a ox cart, a team of oxen and an ox cart, and this troop of men started walking down the Genesee Road. It's Route 5 today. When they crossed Chittenango Creek, they had to follow an Indian path, turn south, follow an Indian path up Brinkerhoff Hill. And at the top of the hill, they camped out for the night. And this picture here, I tried to show approximately where they camped out that night. It was about May 5th or 6th in 1793. It's right on the border, north border of Cazenovia, probably a little bit east of Ridge Road. Next slide. Well, go back. Should have put a blank in there. That next morning, when they got up, John Lincoln was so excited. He knew he was very close to the lake. He was only 7 miles from the southern end of the lake. He was so excited about getting to the lake, he left the group. And I should say that John Lincoln actually came up and visited that narrow band of land that we looked at in the fall of 1792. And he kept a log of everything he looked at. The trees, the land. He started at the southern end down by Cincinnatus and came back and forth. And in that journal, to get in the light here, on October 11th, we came to the military line at noon. Now, how he knew where he was, I'm baffled. I do know that this was surveyed, and I do know that the surveyors put an axe mark on the trees. I knew that though there's witness trees on the corner of every property that they documented, but somehow when he went back and forth between the 20 townships and the military tract, he knew where he was. Where he was at that moment was probably down near Delphi. And he goes, we hit the line, the military line, we hence traveled north-northeast, arrived at the lake where we encamped. He would arrive at the lake in the evening of October 11th. And this is what he wrote in his journal, and I can imagine him sitting at the end of the lake writing this. He goes, situation superb, fine land. We know, he didn't at the time, we know that he spent the rest of his life looking at that view down Cazenovia Lake. So the next day, I know you're wondering, when are we going to talk about barns? I'm getting there. I'm getting to the first barn. So John and Sam went ahead of the group. They arrived at the end of the lake, and it was May 7th, and they were sort of scouting around on the this would have been up where the tennis club is, where the Brewster is. They were kind of walking around. Evening came, and the rest of the entourage hadn't made it, and they had all the food, the tents and everything, and they were wondering, what are we going to do? Lo and behold, 3 men came walking down the west side of the lake. White men. They had been up at the lake fishing. Their names were Phineas Barnes, Charles Coe, and Joseph Atwell. They had settled in Pompey Hollow the year before. And they saw that John and Sam didn't have any food. And so they offered to share their dinner with them. And here, every person here that grew up on a dairy farm is going to be able to relate to this story. They took out some pork and bread. And as they were eating it, John looks at them and says, this bread tastes like onions. And the 3 men kind of looked at themselves and smiled. And they go, leeks. And they said, we made the bread from cow's milk, and the cow has been out eating leeks. And every dairy farmer knows when their herd goes out to fresh spring grass, the taste of the milk changes. That cow that did that milk would have been in some sort of shelter. That, I would say, is our first barn in the area. There actually is, if you take Route 20 down into Pompey Hollow, at the bottom of the hill, you go north on Pompey Hollow Road, turn right, you go up about a mile, you'll come to a sign, the home of Joseph Atwell. Now I would have put the sign on the west side of the road, not the east, but somewhere around there, you could make the argument is the first barn in the Cazenovia, in the area. Next slide. This is Joseph Atwell right here. He took out one of his friends take a picture of him and put it in the cloud. But this is the cabin in the woods. And like I would say, it was a lean-to, a log lean-to with a bark hut that probably the cow was in. This drawing was done in the 1830s. Next slide. So May 8th, what happened to our group of woodsmen? They broke an axle on the cart. So that's why they didn't make it there that day. The next day they arrived at the lake. And it was on that day, May 8th, 1793, they started building the land office at the south end of the lake. And now the information I'm going to give you right now, this is a survey of Cazenovia establishment, and that's what John Lincoln called it. 10 years later, 1803. Remember in 93, this was just a forest. There was no houses, there was no fields. 2,831 people had moved in to the area in this 10-year period. So what were these people doing? Well, they were cutting down trees, burning them up, selling the potash, and sowing cereal. That was their first crop, the ash. Sowing cereal grains in between the stumps. Next slide. Oh, you're way ahead of me. All right. And in that inventory, it talks about how many acres of wheat, corn, how many cows, how many horses. But there's two figures that we're really concerned with. One of them has to do with how many framed houses, not log cabins, a framed house, timber frame, like this barn here. There was 80 framed houses. And it also talked about how many framed barns. 123 frame barns. 50% more barns than houses. 10 years later, we have that many frame buildings up in Cazenovia. This picture was actually drawn in 1792. It's along the Mohawk River. But take a look at that picture closely. This is a highly accurate, even though it's stylized, accurate portrayal of being on the frontier in New York State. We got two buildings, and they're different. One is the log cabin right in the middle, has horizontal lines on it, and that roof, that looks like that's a bark roof on that. But what's off to the right? This has vertical lines on it, and that roof is not a bark roof. That is a 3-bay English threshing barn. The sequence of building was, when you arrived that first year, you put up a log cabin. And then you would have put up some sort of log lean-to or structure for any animals or any crops. But as soon as you could, you put up a frame barn. You didn't put up a frame house, you put up a frame barn. That barn is what was important. And in 10 years, they put up 121 of them, 23 of them. Now, the building you're in, I can't tell you that this is one, say that this is one of those buildings. It could be. I can tell you that this building is over 200 years old, and it's just like the barns that would have been built in those 100 barns that were built in that first 10 years. Next slide. Okay, good. So we're going to talk about this building a little bit. Now, I was pretty insistent on having this program in a barn. It saves me a lot of slides. But if I put up slides, I was thinking I didn't want anybody saying that I'm putting up slides that were AI and generated, and I was making up. You are sitting in historic artifact. This cannot be denied. Donald Trump cannot deny that this building exists right here. So I'll get my pouring. Go. That looks good. So to understand these buildings, and literally thousands of them were built in New York State in the first quarter of the 19th century. Most everybody is sitting on the drive floor right here in the middle, where the door is on the end. And then off on this area where I'm standing, this is the mow, and it's always the biggest part of the building. This building is 30 feet by 40 feet, and I've literally measured 100 of these that are exactly 30 feet by 40 feet. And then in the back, that small bay, that bay, if you look at that girt over your head, has a bunch of mortises in it. That's for studs. There used to be a wall there. That was the area for a granary stable over there. And back in that corner, there's actually the mortise work for a door, which you won't be able to see unless you really look hard. Also, this building had a door right here. That girt going across right here, that's a door girt. You see that little, that door standard went in there. And Vince, if you run your hand down the edge of that post, you'll be able to put your finger in a little hole. There was a pintle hole there. Be careful, something might bite you. There's a pintle hole in there for swinging doors that stood in this area right here at one time on this building. And this center aisle, they would fill this area up here with sheaves of wheat. And I.P. Roberts, the first dean of the school at Cornell, talked about filling their 3-bay threshing barn right to the roof with sheaves of wheat. And during the off time and in the winter time, they would lay those sheaves of wheat down on that floor. I'm looking for my flail. Don't tell me I didn't bring it in.
I don't think you brought your flail in. I don't think you brought it.
I did bring it. All right, well, ain't that something? Must have left it in the truck. Whatever, they would take those sheaves of wheat on the floor and hit them with 2 sticks tethered together, usually with eel skin, and that would knock the grain off it. And then they would fork off the straw. They'd open up the doors, and usually on the leeward side they'd put a board, and they'd flip the grain up in the air and let the chaff blow out the door. And that board had a name that was in front of that door, and everybody in here walks over it every day. It's called a threshold. Now, when we look at this building, usually people ask me, what kind of wood? The wood, this was built right around, the trees that were directly around, they were clearing around the building when they were clearing the land. This building has a lot of pine in it. This top plate is pine. The tie beam coming across here is pine. All these timbers have a name. This center post right in here is pine. This tie beam right across here is pine. The tie beams on the 2 ends look like they're beech. The post right here is white ash. The post over here looks like it's ash. We have a couple of posts that are, like this one looks like it's beech. And I do have a little bit of, there was a hemlock, couple of hemlock girts in there. The rafters are going to be beech and maple down through. It's a variety of woods. And it's actually a lot of fun to look at the building from that point. I live in a building like this, and there's like 8 different types of wood in that building. Fun to look at every day. The roof, one thing to understand about a timber frame, you can see we're dealing with boards up here, and there's boards on the side. You can't have a timber frame without a sawmill. John Lincoln put a sawmill up the first year he was here, 1793, and you know where all the longhorns are? Directly behind them is where that mill used to be on Chittenango Creek. And the boards on this roof go back to when this building was built. And there's no doubt that this building was built before 1810 anyway, and it could be one of those 120 buildings that was built in the first 10 years of settlement on it. Also, on this timber right here, the girt here, there was a ceiling on there. And I brought this board. This was laid on top of those timbers and it formed a ceiling. This board is, anybody wants to take this home with them, they can take it. This actually goes back, this is a 200-year-old board. It came out of my barn. But as you look at this, you can see that it's got a flat side and it's round on this side. This is what we call a slab. The first cut, when the sawmill goes down the log, they pull off this slab. To haul a log to the mill and haul all the lumber back with a team of oxen was a big deal. You brought everything back. You didn't toss away stuff like this. You used it. Now, the next cut that is made, we have a flitch. If you look at this, we have two sides that are flat, but the two edges are waney. In this case, they actually have the bark on them. So there's going to be a quiz at the end. So I have more boards like that if anybody would like to use them. In fact, I brought this slab, which was made into a stool. There's three, and you can see those holes in there. But there's some of those boards are this big. Next slide. All right. 1830. We're going to move along here. Second quarter of the 19th century. If you want to read, this is the golden age of homespun. This is the self-sufficient farms that everybody kind of dreams about. But the tools they were using then were no different than the tools they were using 2,000 years earlier. And Faye, there's a little, to give you some idea too of how quickly this area was settled. The population of Nelson in the 1830s, 2,200, Faye?
231.
2,231. The population of Nelson today, as we sit here, 2,000, just a little bit, almost 2,000. More people lived in Nelson in 1830 than live here today. That's how quickly this area was settled. And you wonder, where did all these people come from? Well, back then, at the turn of the century, the population of the country was doubling every 25 years. At the turn of the century, 9 out of 10 people lived on a farm. So you had to double your farms every 25 years. These people were pouring out of New England. During the war, there was no settlement. They just kept having kids. And the land in New England, it sucks. And so moving into here, they just left by the thousands every year and moved into New York and Ohio and headed west. That's where everybody came from. Next slide. Now I did want to talk about another barn. This is a horse barn that would have been built back in this period. And horse barns follow a very distinct pattern. And oftentimes they're going to have windows in them. Next slide. We're going to step inside of this horse barn. This is at the Johnny Appleseed, just up the road. Next slide. When you step in the doors, there's going to be a second floor, about 8 feet up. When you stepped in these doors, what do you see? You're looking right to the roof. The horse barn will have a floor, and on the top of that floor is where they stored hay. And as you walk in those doors, it'll be wide open. There'll be no posts, so they could come in with a wagon, a team of horses, and drive around and not hit anything. Next. In the back of the barn, this is not from Johnny Appleseed. They took all that stuff out to process apples, but you're going to find stalls for the horses. And oftentimes little windows right in the front of each stall. A week ago, the owners of this barn asked me to take a look at it. This is in Cazenovia. This is a horse barn right in town. It's been modified to handle cars, but you can see here, next slide. When I shot over there in the morning, I'm going to get a slide of this. while the morning sun was on it, I forgot about the tree. But right next door to it is this barn, exactly the same. You can see the door for the hay going in and the front door for the carriages next. And in the back, there's a lean-to. You see those little windows? That's where the stalls are next. There's the stalls for that little horse barn. Oftentimes, particularly in town, the horse barn would follow the motif of the house. They would carry those rhythms into it. Next. And arguably, well, not arguably, no doubt, the most walked-in horse barn in Cazenovia is right here. Next. And if you go in the back, you're going to see the horse stalls still in the bookstore at the Cazenovia Library. Next. Okay, so we're going to move pretty quickly here. I'm going to read. I don't do much reading, but I do a couple of quotes. Maybe I can do this without glasses.
It's okay if you need glasses, Dad.
Okay, all right. I'm going to do a quote of 1850. This is out of Thompson's Geography of New York State. New York was America's premier agricultural state. There were more farms, more acreage under cultivation, had the highest cash value of farms, the greatest value of farm implements, and it was the most productive dairy state in the Union. 1 million milk cows. New York led in butter and cheese production. It was second to Ohio in sheep. Livestock, it had twice the livestock of any state in the Union. Crops, it was third in wheat, but it was first in oats, potatoes, barley, buckwheat, and orchard products. It was the leading market gardening state, and it led in hay, grass seed, hops, maple products, bee products, and meat products. The mid-century New York State was the Empire State when you start talking about agriculture anyway. So, there was one figure there I hope you paid attention to, 1 million milk cows. So where are we putting 1 million milk cows? Next slide. Well, we were in the 20s, 1820s, we started having, in mid-century, when you start talking dairy, you're not talking about fluid milk, you're talking about cheese and butter. And the Hudson River Valley, Mohawk River Valley, in the 1820s started doing cheese and butter. By mid-century, it had moved into where we are right now. Now, they put up a mid-century dairy barn. It's basically a lot like our 3-bay, except there was a basement underneath. And in that basement, a raised basement, usually, is where the cows were. Next slide. This is at the Cody homestead. And I got to ask this, probably I shouldn't. I did a tour of this homestead in '85, so that's almost 40 years ago. Is there anybody here that attended that tour? There we go. Now that's saying how old you are right there, man. Yeah, that was one of my first lectures, attending that tour. This barn was built in 1863, and this is a mid-century dairy barn. Next slide. Now, we built all these 3-bay threshing barns. So the farmer's moving into dairying. What did he do with his 3-bay? Trash it? No, he didn't trash it. Next slide. He took his 3-bay, lifted it up on a foundation, and turned it into a dairy barn. And the barn you're in right now, next slide, has a basement under it. This barn was on the ground when it was first built, and it was raised up. It was probably dragged here, raised up, and there's an area underneath, and if it's not raining when you walk, you look underneath, you'll see it whitewashed. Though that whitewashing is 20th century, has nothing to do with the 19th century. But they converted their little 3-bay into a dairy barn. Now when they did that, next slide. Okay. This is what's underneath. Here's Faye trying to get out of the way, but I got him. That's what you'll see underneath. Well, there, okay, that's fine. You can leave it there. Notice there wasn't any posts. We were right dead center of the barn. It's like the cows would come into the center and the stanchions are off to each side. So we have this post coming down through upstairs here, and setting out on the field, there'd be just a stone underneath this post. That's all the foundation it was under. It'd be a stone under each post. Once they put that basement under it, what's going to hold this post up and help hold that tie beam up? Well, that's what these little slanted timbers are right here. This is a truss, and it's kind of like you're buttoning up something at an angle to hold the center up on it. Now, Faye has been waiting. Maybe you've already figured it out, I'm thinking. You haven't figured it out yet? Okay. He wants to know why on this side, this is the top chord of the truss, but they're sawn. There's another little truss back there. Those are hewn. He said, why are they different? Carl, you ready? Come on, I prepped you for this. That's it. That's it. What's That's it. If you run your hand underneath that top chord there, you're going to see a bunch of mortises in it. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see, but if you look down this post, there's some empty mortises right there. You see those? Those timbers were in there, and that was formed the mow, we'll call it a mow girt, forming a little knee wall here to keep the hay in. Those came out of this barn, Faye. That's why they're hewn. They didn't toss them out. They used them again right there. Next. So, hay, the most important crop grown in New York State. It's still more acreage in hay than any other acreage in the state. And handling hay was a big deal. Right around the Civil War, we developed a way, instead of, in this building here, they would just come in with a hay wagon and pitched it off. And with a fork, you could pass it up about this high. In the 1860s, they started playing around with a horse-powered hay fork. And by the end of the Civil War, they'd come up with the idea of putting a track in the top of the barn and running a trolley that goes back and forth. And you can see that, and it had to be careful. And it would drop down onto the load of hay, pick up a load of hay, and sashay one side or the other. You look in this barn, look up. There's a track up there. Now in this barn, it's actually a rod. And right there is the trolley. It's too bad we don't have the fork here. But that'd be connected up with ropes that would drop down onto that load of hay. Now these timbers right here, you see how new they look? When they fixed up the barn, they put them in. They took the originals out when they put that hay track in up there. And they added these when they redid it. And it's pretty rare to find a barn that doesn't have a hay track in it. Pretty rare to find a barn that still has, this is a girt that goes between the purlin posts in here, that still has the purlin post girt in it. Next slide. So what did this do to barn architecture? Arguably, it changed the architecture more than any other machine. The barns went straight up in the air. And this is this is after the Civil War. This is the Ryan farm. Jamie Hufftalon has an organic dairy in this building. See how tall that building is compared to our little 3-bay? Next slide. This is the interior of it. You look down that, you go into a barn that's tall, and you look down and you can see that it's been built specifically to allow that load of hay to slide down through it. You know you're dealing with a barn built after the Civil War. That's when you first start seeing barns built for the war, built for a hay track. Next slide. This is just down the road here. Next slide. Now there's no way to get up on top here. I didn't know what this building was. I just wanted to take a peek. So I stuck my camera right in this little opening. Next slide. Somebody's got a key problem. Okay. Yeah, we got it. Good. You can see that this building was built, as soon as I looked at that, I said to myself, I know this was built after the Civil War because it was designed for a hay track. You can see that up on top is wide open. Next slide. And this is the other side of it, going right up to the top. That barn is half a mile in that direction. Next slide. So, that's good. That's good, I believe. And that's right. This building is had that hay track put in probably, I'm thinking that it was raised up, these trusses put in and the hay track put in all at the same time, probably about the 1870s, 1880s. Next slide. Next. Now often, when you think about barns, everybody thinks gambrel roof. I haven't shown one gambrel roof barn. Here we are in the late 19th century. There wasn't any gambrel roof barns until the late 19th century. There was some, but it wasn't a normal practice. The gambrel roof is directly related to that hay track. Next slide. Take a look at this little, you can see a little profile on the end of that barn. This is one of the few barns that's not from the area. This is in Lafayette. Next slide. This is a little 3-bay, and you can still see the original roof, like the one here, but you can see that gambrel roof going up and over it, and how that opens up the top of that building to allow that load of hay to move down through. The gambrel roof is a result of the hay track. Gambrel roof started becoming dominant on the landscape right at the turn of the century. About after 1900, it was pretty much every barn would have had a gambrel roof on it. This building is on the tour. Next slide. Here we go, Ann. She's been wanting me to explain to her truss plank construction. What's a truss plank? It's been driving her nuts for 2 months now. That's a truss plank. That is literally just 2x10s bolted or nailed together in sort of a triangular shape, but you can see how there's no timber framing in there. There's nothing going across the building. This is a type of barn that was built after, well, between World War I and World War II. Timber framing died out right during World War I, basically. But there's truss plank barns that were built in the 19th century. That's when they were first introduced. Next slide. When you see a building with a gambrel roof plank truss, immediately you can say you're going to be 99% it was built in the 20th century, not the 19th century. Next. Now there is a date on this building, but that date's written on the whitewash. So it's not, it wasn't written there when the building was built, but it is said that this was one of the last barns this guy built, and he's from Erieville, but 41 that this barn went up, just before World War II. Next slide. And these plank trusses, there was companies all over the country that were kind of putting together their own type of little truss, and they had drawings for it, and you could order the design and put up your own building. This happens to be a James Way here. Next. So it just occurred to me, holy cripe. I'll talk about it in a minute. Here we are down in Pompey Hollow at the Dady Farm. And this is another barn. This was built between World War I and World War II. You know those Gothic arch roofs. And this is a picture of the interior. And this barn went up, we weren't not quite sure. Walter Moore married a deity, Walter Moore and Moore Apple Farm. And he actually walked on the top of that barn while it was being built. He said he was about 15 or 16, so it had to be in 41, 42, right around in there. He walked across that building. But, next slide. This is they said it was a Sears Gothic roof barn. You could buy that kit, that barn, from Sears back then. Next slide. And this is built by a fellow named Harold Tobin. And I've walked into a number of buildings. He's a local builder. And he had his little triangular design of dealing with the interior of the building. This was right next to where the schoolhouse at Lorenzo used to be. But there's a number of these little buildings, Tobin barns around the neighborhood. And I got some people from Pompey. We have the Skeel barns built up in Fabius. You do get a local builder. He has a way of putting up his barns, and you drive around and you see his barn all over the place. He built these barns right up until World War II, basically. Next. So another little invention that changed barn architecture. This is a baling hay in the 30s. And when you start baling hay, we put these big barns up to store hay. You're baling hay, it compresses it down. You can store the same amount of hay in about a third the space that you put loose hay in. I asked Ron Lucas, he used Lucas Equipment. He goes way back to Lucas Equipment. I'm thinking of all the different people that own that thing now. Lucas Equipment, I said, when did the hay balers came in? He said, well, it was right after World War II. They were developed in the 30s. The war hit. You didn't go out and buy equipment during the war. After the war, every farmer would have gone after a hay baler, and that's when they sold them like crazy. By the end of the 50s, every farm was baling hay. Very few people were putting in loose hay. Next slide. So what did this do to barn architecture? We just compressed it down to a third of size. The buildings came right back down. And when you drive around and you see an area for the cows, and then just a gambrel roof over it, you can immediately say to yourself, this was built after World War II. It was built in the 50s. This one was built actually in 58. It had a mid-century dairy barn, very tall barn, with it. And that burned in 57, I guess. It's actually directly across the street from my house. The hay that went in that barn are the fields that I live in right now. Next slide. This barn was built in 1958. Next slide. And here you can see we have a mid-century dairy barn. It was probably built in the last quarter of the 19th century with a gable roof. And then we have an addition put on it. That addition would have been built after World War II, the 50s or the 60s. And I contend at this point, and that this is essentially the end of barn building in the area. Next slide. The future, well, this is what goes up today. This is the Holmes farm down by New Woodstock. The changes from 1950 to 1970 in agriculture were huge compared to any other facet of the economy. And barns that we look at around the country, around this area, were built between the settlement period and the 1960s. After that, what went up was pole barns, and they just don't have the same rhythm on the landscape. It's essentially, it's a factory just covered with metal. There's no rhythm to it or romance to it at all. And the way farming techniques have changed. This farm, there's 1,200 cows are milking on this farm. Back during a relationship about cows, back in 1820 when they first started milking a lot of cows in the area. A cow would give about 2,000 pounds of milk. By 1900, they were up to about 4,000 pounds of milk. The cows on that farm there probably averaged 25,000 pounds, one cow. They got 120 of them. That farm, and each of those cows needs 2 acres of fields to feed it. So we're dealing with at least like 4,000 acres of land, which would have been at least 40 farms 100 years ago. But next. So don't try to understand this slide. But there are people in here that will. They'll be able to look at every one of those barns and say what it is. One of those people isn't alive anymore. I was sitting here yesterday talking to Faye, and he was telling me, was it your grandfather or father that had the Model A milk truck?
My father.
Your father. He said, and he lived here. He lived here. And he went out every day and collected milk, and he said, he just drove around within about 1.5 miles, and he filled up his milk truck and took it. Every one of the pictures you see there is within 1.5 miles, and I said to him, well, I got a picture of that in my show. Every one of those buildings we can point to, they're within 1.5 miles of it. And every building within 1.5 miles, we have 2 horse barns, 1 hop barn, 1 granary. We have a dairy barn that was built. We have the dairy barn just down the road that was built. 2 dairy barns built after the Civil War, 1 dairy barn built in the 20th century. Every one of those buildings has a 3-bay barn in it, just like this one, believe it or not. And those barns date back to the first quarter of the 19th century. That's a lot of 3 bays in one area. Next slide. That is Faye's farm. How long do you milk cows there, Faye? There?
Oh, since I was 40 years, I guess you would say that.
And that barn, and that was in the pictures, next slide, there are 2 3-bay barns hooked together. And they have the same bent typology as this building right here. I'm pretty sure the same builder built all 3 of these buildings right here. Next. Okay. Time for an executive decision, Ann. Though we're going to be tough. We got we have a young lady who got married, had her wedding reception in this barn with us. Wow. What time we got?
5 after 3.
It's been an hour?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
You having fun?
Well, we're almost done. Because you're here, Kelly.
Well, it's Andy's family.
I know, but the 2 of you.
He knows more about it than me.
We'll talk about this. We're coming to the end. I could have left this in, taken it out, it didn't matter. But this is a high-profile building. Everybody that goes to the dump drives by this building. And you can drive by it on the way home. Just go out to the road and head west. And you'll see it'll be the first barn you come to. If you would have taken that road 100 years ago, you would have seen 6 other buildings on the way out. So what's this building all about? This building is on the National Register. And we all know that the house burned a 1.5 years ago. 2 years. Okay.
3 years.
3 years. So what's this barn all about? I've always wanted to look at it, and I got in it 2 weeks ago, and I go, holy cow, look at that. So you're going to see it. Next. This is the actual picture that was used for the National Register back in 1987. That's good. Leave it right there. Next. So this is the back of the barn, and I'm going to walk into those doors right here. Now, the actual write-up of this building for the National Register says that this building was built in the 1870s. And it talks about, it's the Abel barn, Jabez, he was actually a settler, and apparently he was one of the first settlers. I think he bought his land for $1.
Supposedly the first,
Okay,
1793.
1793, when John Lincoln was setting up his office, he sold the acreage to this, whoop, you clicked it. He sold the acreage to this farm in 1793. When they wrote this up, the National Register people, they said none of the buildings existed from when the farm was first started back in the 1790s. I stepped in those doors, next slide. This is what I saw. It's another 3-bay barn. This 3-bay barn is a little bit different, but that is artifact that that 3-bay right there stood next to the log cabin that they would have built the first year. So there is artifact there that dates back to the settlement of the area. And for the timber framers in here, there's not many. I don't know. This is a scribe rule building, and the tying joint is a wedged half dovetail on it. All this stuff has names, but don't worry about it. But for the timber framers, this is a wonderful building to get into and look at. A little bit different than this building because, well, I guess I've left that on too long. You can see this tie beam hooks into below the top plate, doesn't come in a level tie beam. But we'll turn that off. Next slide. This shows, you see those little marks? As soon as you see, we call them marriage marks, timber framers. You see those little marks, you know you're dealing with a very early building that's scribe rule. The same way when the Pilgrims and the Puritans arrived here, they were building techniques from Europe. And they were building buildings exactly the same way they did at home. And that was scribed together. Not that we're going to get into that. Next slide. This is in the western side of the building. For everybody going to church tomorrow, either the Presbyterian or down in New Woodstock, and you're sitting in your sanctuary, this is what's over your head. That is a king, that's a king rod truss. The one over your head is going to be a king post truss. But nonetheless, that's a truss spanning 40 feet. Kind of like this thing right here in it. So why are they putting this truss in this building? Well, there's actually a square 40 feet by 40 feet with no posts in it. And there's actually a door to get in there. In horse barns, you do that, and maybe that's what they were thinking. But where the windows are is where this addition was added on with that truss right there. Next slide. So in the report it goes, we don't know when the barn was built. And I'm thinking, when I saw that had Romanesque stones on the corner, I said, I bet you there's a date stone on it. So I don't even know if those people walked up to the building, but that addition was built in 1892. And there it is. So yeah, I'm bad-mouthing the National Register here. I actually know the lady that wrote it up, and she was probably right out of college at the time, and why would they know anything about timber framing or early threshing barns, for sure. But she should have saw that. Next slide. Okay, this is it, last sequence. Uh-oh. There we go, good. Little card my wife made up for me. Faye handed me I asked him for a photograph of Nelson, of his landscape like 100 years ago. So he handed me the top picture there. You can see where the little trees are. That's the four corners of Route 20 and Nelson Road. That's Nelson. So last Sunday I went out with my next door neighbor, and I said, I'd like to get an exact picture like this to show what's happened. And that picture was taken in the 30s. And so we did have one problem. When you go up with, he had a drone. The drones can only go up 400 feet. Once he got to 400 feet, his computer started saying, uh-oh, you can't go any higher. You know, you go any higher than the F-16s are going to come in here and blow it away. So we could only go 400 feet. But still, you're going to get the idea. This is less than 100 years later. We're looking in the same direction. That's the four corners. And you can see how much that has grown up in there. 1793, all forest. Every square inch of the area. Basically, 100 years later, the 19th century, or even, let's say 1924. There'd be very few people in this room, if you stepped out of your house in 1924, your front yard, and looked at the landscape, would know where they were. It was practically clear cut. Theoretically, in the Madison County history, they say 90% of Madison County had been cut. I don't know if it's that high. I know it was at least 80 for sure, but there was no trees anywhere. Now, it's about an exact reversal. About 60-70% is trees, and the rest of it is meadow. So we did a little, this winter I did a little survey, knowing that this project was coming up. And I drove around and counted all the barns in Cazenovia and Nelson. And we had 151 barns in Caz and 69 barns in Nelson. Next slide. Now we have these great maps here that were done right around the Civil War. This is 1959. And unfortunately, you can't see it from here, but on there, every house is listed, and it's got a name under it saying who is the primary owner or whatever. And so I could count every house in the town of Caz and in the town of Nelson.
Isn't that 1859? You said 19.
Yeah.
Oh, 1859, I'm sorry. Yep. Yep, Biden moment on it. So, back in 1859, every house would have had at least a horse barn on it. And if it had been a farm, there would probably been a horse barn, a dairy barn. There could have been a corn crib, chicken coop, hog pen. But let's just say that the one barn with every house. And I didn't even talk about the villages, even bother to count the villages, the houses in the village, because it's just too complicated. The number of houses in 1859 in Cazenovia was 436. That would have been at least 436 barns. You could easily, conservatively, double that. So that's 900 barns. And you could certainly make a case for 1,000 of them on the eve of the Civil War. And remember too, when I counted the barns, I'm counting all the barns that were built after 1860 also. Nelson, 308 houses in Nelson before the Civil War around the area. So now I did do a little, as I'm driving around looking at the buildings, I get a pretty good, I can look at it and say probably 95% of the time I can tell if it's in the 19th century or the 20th century. And I divided up that figure between 20th century and 19th century. In Caz, about 84 of the buildings that I counted were 19th century. So we had conservatively 1,000 barns before the war. There's less than 100 of those buildings on the landscape today. In Nelson, I counted 46 that would have been, that date back into the 19th century. Now remember how I introduced the talk. I'm going to talk about an artifact disappearing from the landscape. Artifact, artifact, what's an artifact? Artifact is a man-made object disappearing that we don't use anymore. And these buildings, Well, we aren't using them for barns anymore. We're using them for lectures. So and we're not going to save these buildings. It's crazy to think that every barn should be saved. The only reason I mention all this is just as when you drive home, you can take a look and say, look at that. There's an artifact that's not going to be here much longer, and it's sort of a sense of appreciation of what the landscape used to look like, 100 years ago. So you want to take questions or you want to end it?
Well, first off, I think we need to all. Cazenovia Heritage would also like to thank the Lions and yourself with something to take home with you today.
Okay. Libations?
Pardon?
Libations? Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
I think I heard you preferred red.
Okay.
Anyone have any questions for Randy? Okay, that's
John?
So we're the folks that just moved here a couple of years ago that lived next to Randy and Betsy. And when we got here, one of the things we noticed was hanging from our mailbox was this little pig. And then we saw them all over the place and we heard about all the Pig City. What period of time did things shift from mostly livestock to pigs, from cattle to pigs or whatever? How does that all play out?
Okay, well, you're talking about, when you start talking about agriculture, it is very complicated. That's why I'm trying to keep it simple with just these barns. The first 25 years it was clearing the land and you're sowing cereal grains in between the stumps. But second 25 years you're moving into hogs and corn. Actually, corn was the most important grain, even at like clearing the land. I did talk about when dairying took place. Now, 90% of the barns that you see out there today is either going to be a dairy barn or a horse barn. And dairying is still in New York State the number one agricultural and money in New York State. Okay. Yes.
What material was used for the roofing over the years?
It was all 19th century. It was all hand split, pine or oak, maybe sometimes hemlock shingles. This building would have had a hand split shingle roof on top of it. As you move, you start seeing steel roofs, steel sheets in the beginning, in the like 1920. Moving into the 20th century, you start getting steel roofs being put on, some roofs of steel being put on, yes.
Yes.
Randy, can you see me?
Yep.
How old were you when the barn virus first hit you, and is there any cure for it?
I could actually tell you. I have distinct memories going up to my grandfather's farm in Pompey. He milked 20 jerseys, jumping in the hay in that barn. They're vivid in my mind.
Well, don't lose that disease.
And I went back to that barn back when I was in college, or after I started doing the business. At the time, I can remember looking at the end wall and seeing that there was timbers that had mortises that were empty, and there was timbers that were logs, and it had a gambrel roof, and it didn't make any sense. I went back to that when I started the barn business and walked in, and here was a 3-bay English barn where the roof was taken off, the gambrel roof put on, and there was a bay added on to the end of it. It's like the history is written in the fabric, and if you know how to read it, it's a wonderful, wonderful. In fact, I was going to say, anybody would like me to look at your barn, you can get my phone number from one of the historical societies. I'd be glad to take a look at it. I'll tell you more about your barn than you ever wanted to know.
Don't forget to download the map if you want to go on the tour. There are 2 threshing barns, there are are 7 dairy barns that shows the evolution of dairy barns from 1850 to 1950, along with 2 horse barns. So feel free to do that or see me afterwards. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.